As I say, we tend not to focus on places like Niger and Chad and Burkina Faso and things, but there's a lot of developments going on right now there that are not particularly good for the U.S. or even U.S. investors.
Yeah, well, I mean, there are almost no journalists on the ground, but that doesn't mean it doesn't matter. And this part of the world does matter. It matters in particular because there are a lot of resources that are very important for industrial processes, especially as we turn to transition energy away from coal and towards, batteries, and they require a lot of what we get out of the ground from these countries. But governance in this part of the world is very poor indeed. Explosion of insurgencies, Islamic radicalism, and very poor local governance with a lot of military coups that have happened in these countries. And some of the most authoritarian, most brutal leaders in the world want to turn to a country that'll provide them support for security and not ask any questions at all about their human rights abuses and governance on the ground. And, the best country for that at scale, that's Russia.
Well, and to speak of that, I mean, it's, I guess, a reconstitution of the Wagner Group, now called Africa Corps, that has moved in.
Africa Corps, yeah.
They actually reportedly have some troops on the ground that have displaced some U.S. and French forces.
That's right. In many of these countries, they have told the Americans, the French, to get out after the military has taken over the leadership of the country. And they want they need paramilitaries, they need advanced military equipment, and they're willing to pay for it. And if they don't have hard currency, they can give you a percentage or control or an interest in state-controlled companies on the ground that have access to these minerals. And the Russians are more than happy to do that. Now, that used to be through the Wagner Group. Of course, the Wagner Group quite historically imploded when Mr. Prigozhin, who ran it and had been a very close informal advisor to Putin, turned against Putin. It has since been reconstituted with many of the same people and all of the same weapons on the ground. This group that is now directly reporting to Putin and the Russian military, called the Africa Corps.
So, Ian, what is U.S. policy toward West Africa now? What should it be? Is there a way for us to compete with the Russians? And by the way, do we want to compete with them, given the nature of some of those juntas that are running some of those countries these days?
Well, I mean, it's like saying what's American policy in, Iran or Bashar Assad's Syria or Kim Jong-un's North Korea. These are not countries the Americans can have functional diplomatic relations with because they're considered rogue states. They're considered illegitimate. They don't have the support of their people to be in charge. So, again, if these countries push the Americans out, I mean, the U.S. historically has had a fair amount of interest in what's called the guerrilla belt. And here I mean like guerrilla, the animals, as opposed to guerrilla, the illicit fighters, through Central Africa. And the U.S. has a lot of troops on the ground, has provided humanitarian aid, and is trying to help provide security. But when you have countries like Chad, like Niger, like Burkina Faso, that are run by military juntas that overthrow their legitimate government, the U.S. policy is containment. It's to try to ensure that the instability of that country doesn't spill over into other countries that the U.S. can work with. That's both true in terms of forced migration. It's true in terms of radicalism and extremism. And it's also true in terms of direct border incursions and invasions. So, I mean, it's not as if the United States is competing with Russia for influence over these governments. No, rather, these are governments that the Americans would rather see out of power.
Let's come back to where you started with the possible ramifications economically, particularly when it comes to energy transition, because of some of those raw materials that really exist in those countries. Uranium, certainly lithium, bauxite, others. What are the possible ramifications for investors if, in fact, Russia's influence continues to grow in West Africa?
Well, it's going to be a greater cost because, again, these are countries that are going to have resources that will be exploited in illicit ways, in illegal ways, using child labor, for example. They're not going to be welcomed in supply chain by many advanced industrial democracies in the world. And even when they are, the Russians are going to have a preference to ensure that the supplies are first and foremost given to friends of Russia with preferential long-term contracts. China, of course, being the country in that category that has the greatest need for them. And there are a lot of resources here. I mean, the Russian government has secured direct access to, major gold reserves in the Central African Republic, as well as in Sudan, platinum in Zimbabwe, diamonds in Zimbabwe, as well as the CAR, uranium, as you mentioned, in Namibia. Right now, the United States still gets uranium from Russia, and Congress is trying to stop that. They're trying to actually ensure there's money to increase production in the United States and with friends, so that if the U.S. is going to start building reactors again, you've seen the Bill Gates announcements on your own Bloomberg, that they don't have to get it from Russia. But the more that Russia is on the ground, essentially the lead supporter of many of these illicit governments, these military regimes in Central and Western Africa, the Russians are going to end up also having control over some critical nodes of the minerals that are necessary for a transition energy revolution.
Ian, West Africa has historically been a zone of influence for France because they colonized it. At the same time, Mr. Macron right now is distracted with a few other things closer to home with this snap election he's called less than 3 weeks away now. Give us a sense of what the possible ramifications of this are.
Macron's own party, Center Party, lost historically 17 points under the national rally far right of Marine Le Pen. And so on the back of that really embarrassing, much larger than expected loss, and by the way, historic, over 50% of French registered voters turned out to vote in this European parliamentary election. That doesn't sound high, but for a European parliamentary election with not much at stake, it's by far the highest that France has ever had. It's a huge embarrassment. It felt like he was going to get censored by the government over the course, by the parliament over the course of the fall. It meant that his budget wasn't going to get through. He wasn't going to be able to continue to be fiscally responsible. So he decided to call a snap election, which in France means 3 weeks of campaigning, and then they go and vote. And the idea for Macron being, if he wins, because you'll have 70% turnout for a parliamentary election as opposed to 50 for the European parliamentary elections, that suddenly his party will do better. He'll be able to scare people away from voting for the far left or the far right. But the left-wing parties have all come together, and they are working to not run candidates against each other in parliament. So that's a big problem for the center. And the average French citizen doesn't believe that Le Pen and her party is a threat to democracy. Only 40% say that they are, compared to 80%, David, 20 years ago. So look, anything can happen, but right now, and we're only a week and a half away, these elections look very bad for Macron, very dangerous. And if Le Pen and the National Rally are able to capture government and her party takes the premiership, well, then, anything in the European Union that requires agreement of all the parliaments, she will be opposed to. So France will no longer be one of the strongest supporters of, for example, more aid for Ukraine or greater defense spending for Europe or more fiscal accountability or more coordination on industrial policy. No, instead, one of the largest and founding members of the EU will be strongly opposed to EU consolidation and sovereignty, supranational governance. It's a huge risk, especially against the backdrop of U.S. elections, which if Trump wins, you'll have a president that supports a Frexit from the EU and a much weaker EU, very different from Biden.
Just my question, Ian, is it too far to go to speculate about the possibility of, as you said, a Frexit, not Brexit, but Frexit? Because, as you said, Marine Le Pen has been fairly hostile to the European Union.
She is very hostile, but Brexit went very badly for the UK. And one of the reasons why Marine Le Pen is polling so well in her party is because she's backed away from a Frexit, instead just picked up all of the policies that show Euroscepticism. So I certainly think that were she to become premier, I don't think they would agitate for an exit, but I think she would be very aligned with Viktor Orban's Hungary, and she'd be very aligned with a Trump policy on Europe, which essentially means that Europe would get weaker, not stronger, at a time that a lot more countries, including Ukraine, are counting on a stronger Europe for their own well-being.